Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. Oh my goodness, I appreciate you being with me. Hope your week has gone real well. Mine has been just awesome. Okay, and hearing from lots and lots of new people. I tell you, things are exciting. Well, we come today. This is video number 20 in our examination and refutation of Sam Frost's book, the Parousia of the Son of Man. Had that right here. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. This is video number 20, and you know, as promised, I think I'm going to make this my very last video in response and refutation of Sam Frost's book, The Parousia of the Son of Man. Pardon me, and the reason for that is quite simple. Even though he has a good bit of discussion of the book of Hebrews, there's really nothing in his discussion of the book of Hebrews, number one, that would counter anything that I've said. Number two, that would change his position on resurrection and eschatology from that which he sets forth in his comments on 1 Corinthians 15. In other words, he believes that the resurrection and eschatology of 1 Corinthians 15 is the same eschatology of Hebrews, right? So, if and since I am demonstrating the fallacy of his eschatology in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that effectively answers everything that he has to say in the book of Hebrews. And I promise to keep my review and refutation of his book to about 20 videos. So, unless I change my mind, I reserve the right to do so. Unless I change my mind, this will be the last video that I'm going to do in response to Sam Frost. Now, there's a brand new book out by a guy named Lance Conley. It's a book of 500 pages, and it's kind of funny. When Sam Frost wrote this book, everybody was saying, "Oh, this is the book you've got to have. This refutes preterism." Well, now all of a sudden, Lance Conley's book is being touted as, "Oh, this is the book you've got to have." Yeah. Well, I haven't read the entirety of Mr. Conley's book yet, but you will see that it is every bit as easy, maybe even more so, to refute as Mr. Frost's book on the Parousia. What I have read so far is absolutely chock full of logical presuppositions, logical fallacies, and I would just simply say this: if Mr. Conley didn't have the early Christian writings, he wouldn't have an eschatology. That's how much emphasis he puts on the patristic writings. To me, that illustrates as much as anything could that his eschatology is false. So, I'm gonna take probably a week or two, maybe even 3, break from my Friday morning musings. I may insert something else in there, just because. But I'm going to take about a 3-week break from responding to the critics, and then I will take up Mr. Conley's book on the, I think it's Resurrecting, or Hope Resurrected, excuse me. Almost forgot the name of it there. So be looking forward to that. Okay, so in Sam Frost's book, The Parousia of the Son of Man, in commenting on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Mr. Frost talks about the resurrection being the time when sin and death would be destroyed. I got to tell you, how anyone could make the arguments that Mr. Frost does. And by the way, I just have to have to make the following comment. His comments essentially actually ignore Paul's emphasis on the resurrection being when sin and the law would be destroyed, would be overcome. I mean, I've been sitting here reading this morning, and as I've gone through, I have tried to find Mr. Frost's comments on 1 Corinthians 15, 55, and 56 of the resurrection being the time when the law, that was the strength of the sin, would be overcome, because the sting of death is sin. Thus, the resurrection would be when sin, the sting of death, would be overcome. But you know what? Mr. Frost, unless I missed it, but I've spent good bit of time this morning trying to find his comments. And, if he does, again, I apologize, but I just simply haven't found where he discusses those verses. Now, since those verses are basically Paul's summary statement about the resurrection, you would think he would spend some time focusing on that. Now, in stark contrast with his seemingly total omission of any reference to the passing of the law that was the strength of the sin, and the removal of sin, which was the strength of the sin, instead of saying, literally leaving it out, again, unless I missed it, that stands in stark contrast with the comments that he made in his earlier book, the Essays on the Resurrection. On page 76 and following, and I'm going to take the time to read a good bit here, because you will see the clarity of thought, the excellent exegesis and logic that is employed here, as opposed to the total lack of discussion in this book. Okay? If we take Paul's sequence here, and I won't go into discussing that, it becomes even clearer. If the sting of the death is the sin, and the power of the sin is the Torah, now, I want you to note that in 2 footnotes, let me point out that in footnote 79 and 80, Mr. Frost quotes from my material, but he never attests it to me. He never accredits the citations. He quotes from an article by a scholar by the name of Vlakos that I sent him, and that he thanked me for sending him. And he cites from the article without ever saying, I appreciate Don Preston sending that article to me. But all of that aside, notice how Mr. Frost admits that Paul is talking about the end of the Torah. Obviously, when the sin and the law are overcome, then obviously the sin loses its power. And he asked, what happens when the sin loses its power? Quite clearly, the death loses its sting. Thus, all we need to ask is, when did the requirement of the law under the old covenant vanish and lose its place? Hebrews 8:13 answers this question. That which is vanishing and being made old shall soon disappear. Unquote. The destruction of the temple in that generation marks the end of the age and the dawning of the age to come. Again, as the text makes clear, the victory being asked of death and Sheol is salvation victory. Paul thanks God through Christ who is giving us the victory. It is not will give us the victory, unquote. It is something, again, in keeping with what has been started through Christ, the victory over the body of death, Romans 7:25, which comes through Christ. However, pay very careful attention here. If resurrection is resurrection of physical bodies, and if that victory has not happened in the least, then how can any victory be claimed? The victory comes when the death is swallowed up in victory at the supposed resurrection of corpses. If the death here means physical death, then we cannot at all claim any victory since we still physically die. Jesus has not yet put that under his feet. He's still waging a war. In a war, victory can be proclaimed, but it cannot be something that is gained until the war is over and the enemies are entirely defeated. Then why does Paul use an active participle rather than a future? For he is giving us the victory. Over what? Has God been giving the victory over physical death for 2,000 years to the church? That's absurd. So far, God has lost every Christian since Peter to physical death. Not one has been raised, and not one can claim victory over the death. How is this winning the war? Unquote. And he gives a footnote to my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, quote, for an extended discussion of these issues. The question of Christ's substitutionary death, the atonement, the reality of forgiveness are all issues that press in on us when we deny the reality of present life in Christ or the lack thereof. Simply stated, if sin brings death, physical death per modern Christianity, but forgiveness removes sin, then it must be true that forgiveness delivers from physical death. Thus, the child of God should never die physically. The reality that even the most faithful Christian dies physically falsifies the idea that physical death is the death that Christ came to defeat. And I have all of that, by the way, in my new book, The Death of Adam, the Life of Christ. But here's what I want you to catch. In this book, Mr. Frost is absolutely laser focused on truth. And he says, the strength of the sin was the Torah, the law of Moses. And folks, I got to tell you, if this is true, and it is, because the only law that was the strength of sin was the Old Covenant law. Paul said, I had not known sin except the law said, thou shalt not covet. Well, what law said, thou shalt not covet? It was the law that Paul knew as Torah, the law of Moses. Now, since the resurrection would be when the law, and by the way, when the term law is used with the definite article, well over 100 times. When it's used with the definite article, unless the context absolutely demands that it's not talking about the law of Moses, then it invariably refers to the law of Moses. Therefore, since the resurrection would be when the law would be removed, then since the law was the law of Moses, it therefore follows that the resurrection would be at the end of the law of Moses. Okay, the resurrection would be at the end of the law of Moses, the law. But the resurrection has not yet happened, according to Sam Frost in the Parousia of the Son of Man. Therefore, the law of Moses has not passed away. That not only falsifies Mr. Sam Frost, it falsifies all of the modern view of resurrection. And then Paul said that the resurrection would be when the sting of death would be removed. And Mr. Frost rightly points out, well, what happens when you, let me read this again. If the sting of the death is the sin and the power of the sin is Torah, then what happens when you remove the Torah and its demands? Obviously, the sin loses its power. What happens when sin loses its power? Quite clearly, the death loses its sting. But you must catch the power of this. Mr. Frost believes that you and I, as faithful Christians living by faith, are still totally subject to sin. How do I know that? Well, he says we all died for Adam's sin and our own. Those are his words. Therefore, every Christian remains subject to the last enemy, which Mr. Frost falsely claims is physical death. But if physical death is the last enemy, then you and I are still subject to the last enemy. But, you see, if the sting of death is the sin, then since we still die, you and I are subject to and experience the sting of the death. So let me ask you a question. Where is forgiveness? You know, again, in this book, I discuss all of these issues. Not only this book, but in my We Shall Meet Him in the Air book. As Mr. Frost rightly pointed out, I cover all of these issues, and I emphasize them. I bring up more information, more thoughts, new information in this book, The Death of Adam, The Life of Christ. Mr. Frost was absolutely correct to point out that subjects of the substitutionary death of Christ, the atonement, and forgiveness are all issues that absolutely must be considered. Because if there is still physical death as a result of sin, then since Christians experience physical death, there is no forgiveness. No sin, no death. The wages of sin is death. No sin, no death. Since Christians still die, obviously, physically, then guess what? You and I have no victory whatsoever. We must still experience the sting of death. Is that the victory that Paul was talking about? Thanks be to God that gives us the victory. We're still subject to the last enemy. We still have the sting of death to experience. We must all succumb to the death curse of Adam. Victory! If that is your victory, I say this with all kindness, you can have it. But you see, I rejoice in the forgiveness and the salvation of Christ. Forgiveness means no sin. No sin means no death. It's that simple. It's that undeniable. And with that simple, undeniable reality, Mr. Sam Frost's book, The Parousia of the Son of Man, is completely and totally refuted. Thanks for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. You have a fantastic weekend. Lord willing, see you on Monday.